Hello, I'm Matthew Gavidia. Today in the MGH Life Sciences Medical World News, the Center for Biosimilars is pleased to welcome Dr. Swami Iyer, Professor of Medicine in the Department of Lymphoma and Myeloma at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
So thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity and introduction. So I'm Swami Iyer. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. My area of work is in hematological malignancies, particularly in lymphomas and T-cell lymphomas. I'm happy to be here.
And to get us started off, can you please tell us about the importance and the difference biosimilars and generics have made for improving access to medication in both India and the United States?
Absolutely. I think, Matthew, before I say that, I also always have to profess that whatever I say is my opinion. And as we take care of patients and patients with very sick conditions like lymphomas, we often need to have medications that are potentially life-saving. Obviously, we work with a lot of partners and stakeholders, if you will. So there are a lot of people at play. So whatever I say is we're trying to work our way through the ecosystem so that the drugs are available to the patient, to focus the patient in the center of this whole ecosystem, if you will. That being the case, I think the big question, and I think the most important question you asked, was the role of biosimilars. And so a lot of research has gone in, a lot of new medications have come out of that. And accessibility to those new medication is the question at hand. There used to be the world of chemotherapy 20, 30 years ago, which would kill a lymphoma, at the same time would affect the patient and cause a lot of side effects, right? So I think it definitely still has a place, but now we have come out with smarter medications, pills, IV medications and antibodies, immunotherapies and CAR T therapies. So all these are more fine-tuned versions that do only the job of killing the lymphoma, and in theory have little side effects on the patients, right? So that being said, these research advances that have happened also bring with it a lot of cost, and these medications are expensive. The cost of finding these new medications, integrating the biology, doing clinical studies, there is a lot of expense attached to it. And so when these new medications come out, there is a lot of cost attached to it. And oftentimes patients don't have access to this for one reason or the other, whether it's a result of not having an insurance, or if they have an insurance, the insurance companies may not be in a position to approve it right away, even if it's an FDA approved label. The first 5 to 10 years of the life of a new drug is always challenging for various reasons. Yes, it is a life-saving option for many patients, but in some ways it's haves and have-nots that the situation comes up, and it shouldn't be the case, right? So everybody who has a lymphoma, no matter what the background is, should have access to these medications. So in that context, the role of biosimilars and generics is very important, and we can talk more about what the place might be for each one of those things. But the biosimilars and generics have made an impact, have been able to bridge the gap, and we took a snapshot of that situation, particularly in a very small subset of cancer called lymphomas and CLLs, where we actually looked at the availability of biosimilars and generics in that disease entity. We listed all those medications available in the US and the ones that are available in India, for example, where oftentimes the research is not done to find the original drug. So the original drug is called the originator, right? The first time that is found, but it's much easier once the originator comes along, either the ability to come up with copies of those or have generic versions of those. For cancer, very similar to what happened in the HIV era, right? So in the HIV era, it is rampant, or it is just like the pandemic right now. HIV is also sort of a pandemic in its own terms, and that needed medications, and out came these generics, which made a huge difference. I think hopefully we can get there with cancer drugs as well.
How would you address the concern among drug originator companies that such solutions will not enable them to recoup a reasonable return on their investment?
And as I said earlier, it's an ecosystem, right? So everybody has a part to play in this, and in trying to bring the drug to life, so to say, go through the trials and tribulations of of regulations, clinical studies, and market and whatnot. So the cost that is involved in doing that, and how are they going to recoup that? And I think that's the concern that companies have. Obviously, there is also the founder effect and finding the first drug to get to that. And in some ways, these are aspects of the global multidimensional approaches that we take. Some of these drugs and the cost of the drugs that come through, at least in the United States, and I don't know how these numbers come out, but I know that companies, when they do come out with drugs, they also have they have to go through an approval process through FDA. The FDA approves the drug. FDA does not tell you what the price of the drug should be. There's nothing in the United States that tells you what the price of the drug should be. So the companies do their own due diligence on the market. So then that's when the market forces come to play, and that's when they subject the pricing to that aspect. Now, you can talk all about that in macroeconomic and microeconomic aspects, and I'm not qualified certainly to do that. My job is to see how we can bridge the gap, right? So that being said, if we are able to create opportunities for everybody, and I think drug companies, at least in the US, are able to do this in some ways by creating foundations and getting free drugs for patients. So they do fill some gaps, especially for the ones without insurance. And there are situations where they cannot do anything. For example, if it's a Medicare or a Medicare equivalent insurance companies, they may or may not be able to help out in many ways, depending upon the complexities of the insurance that the patients have. So there are lots of areas that they could do a better job. And I think they are trying to do that. But I think you need, like everything else, you need a quarterback to push this through. And that's the situation in the US. And the companies want to retain that ability to regain the cost that they've spent in developing this drug. When it comes to beyond the US, I think it's a little different. I think the companies take a different approach. I know because a lot of countries have their own ways of regulating things. In Europe, they regulate the prices. Each country has its own pricing. And many countries like India, for example, have their own modalities. Japan has its own approval process and things like that. So every country is different. Now, if it's a global company, I would think they would think about trying to recoup the cost. But at the same time, I think they are also in a position to understand that the access to drug is as important. Based on some of the precedents that has happened in India with the use of Gleevec, for example. When Gleevec was approved, one of the first targeted therapy in cancer was approved in the year 1999-2000. It was accessible to many people in India after a few years because they were able to copy. And there was a very important worldwide agreement that came along to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, until which time both India and China were not part of that agreement, but the Gleevec somehow slipped through that process and they were able to make copies and made it available to patients in India. And then there's a lot of back and forth lawsuits that went back and forth between Novartis and the Indian courts. And finally, they couldn't get their product through to retain the monopoly there. So I think that's one large precedence that has created the ability to allow some of the generics and also biosimilars in countries like India. So now I think India leads that process in many ways, and the laws are very different there compared to here. And that's the reason they're able to do it. And we can always question if they're right or wrong. But and so whether the companies here in the US are able to recoup the cost of that, I think clearly the answer would be no. They're probably not going to be able to do that. But in other regulated markets, they are able to look into it and are able to think about how they can do it.
Transitioning to the regulatory process, can you tell us about the regulatory review processes in India and how it takes longer than in the United States for essential medicines to be approved?
So in the US, for example, just to give you a background, a drug that goes through a preclinical testing is ready for early phase testing, first in human studies. The application is sent to the FDA. The FDA looks at a protocol and gives them 30 days time to review the paperwork, and then they may come back and say, no, you can go ahead, or you may have to make corrections, or I don't think this is a good idea. And then they go on with the early phase studies, which is typically a phase 1, first in human studies. And then once you know that it is safe in phase 1, then you do a phase 2 study. And then phase 2 studies, at least you know what the dose is, you know some idea about safety. Then you take a certain patient population and expand them into 40 or 50 patients. And then once you see a very strong signal, then you compare it to the standard of care, and then you do a randomized study, either a phase 2 or a phase 3 randomized study, depending upon the disease type. And this whole process, from the time that preclinical work is done to phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, can sometimes take 5 years. So that's a long timeline, right? So and each time it has to go through regulatory bodies, and it's a lot of oversight. There's a lot of work, and the patient safety is the most important consideration in all of these things. When it comes to India, in some ways, many years ago, a lot of companies used to consider India as one of the sites for testing, but a few things happened that were not very conducive to, actually not conducive to patient care. And so the authorities in India said we shall not allow any phase 1 studies to be done here unless it starts in India, unless there's an idea or a concept that originates in India. And on the other hand, if there is a safety track record, if there is some amount of work that's already been elsewhere, and if we are part of a phase 2, phase 3, it could potentially be done in India. And I'm giving you the shorter version of and that's why I think there was a time period where you couldn't do a lot of clinical studies about 10 years ago, and that changed slowly. In other words, the phase 1s are still lagging in India. Phase 2s and phase 3s are possible. Having said that, the timeline in India is very different. It's not a 30-day timeline for each application to go through. Sometimes it's also the need of the hour that can facilitate a faster or expedited processing. And for example, now with the corona pandemic, there are a lot of new medications that are approved, and those get approved within a very short period of time with a small number of patient accruals, anywhere from 50 to 100, for example, in the corona pandemic. For cancers as well, they have a very similar pathway, but they require that they go through a certain amount of phase 2 testing. As long as the safety data elsewhere, they undergo a phase 2 testing, and they go through an accelerated approval process. So it's somewhat analogous to what happens in the US, except there are some restrictions. And you have to mind you, the companies that are likely to do these kinds of work are likely the ones that have their interests in India or have their origin in India. Because India, and you have to understand, one of the reasons why a lot of global pharma doesn't go to India is because it's not an insurance market. The healthcare is out of pocket only now that the insurance is making a penetration. So in other words, they're unable to control the whole system, if you will, or understand the whole system, if you will, because the out-of-pocket costs are sometimes not something that can be estimated or measured, so to say, and to create a financial system. But that's by and far the systems in India are out of pocket. Insurance is making a comeback, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that's one of the reasons why the global pharma players are not able to generally put a lot of interest in Indian companies. So the Indian companies, and perhaps some of them who have a big presence there, the only ones are able to do the phase 2s and the phase 3 studies. And they are able to do so. I think with this regulatory process, the DCGI of India, I think they are able to do these studies, and many of the drugs that have been approved in the US have also been approved in India. And mind you, as I said earlier, there are companies that do the copies and also bioequivalents, and so they're the biosimilars and generics. And mind you, a lot of the work that is done for these larger pharma companies, the back end of the work is actually done by these companies in India. So in some ways, they have the capability, they have the systems in place, they have the FDA approvable locations in place to do and provide these generic drugs. So I think that's how India has been able to generate large volumes of generics and biosimilars.
In addressing disparities, can you speak on disparities in healthcare caused in the United States and India by patent process and the high prices charged for current novel drugs in cancer therapy, particularly lymphoma and CLL?
So I think that's pertinent to the work that we did. And as I told you earlier, there's a drug approval process that takes about 5 years, and there is a cost of doing research. and there's an FDA approval, and there's no bodies in the US, at least, regulating the cost of or the pricing of the drug. And that is in some ways dictated by the market needs and the company's uh, corporate goals, if you will. In India, it's different. I think in India, there's a larger volume. There is a need, and there's an unmet need. There is usually a drug in place. And take CLL and lymphoma, they're not uncommon. They're very common diagnosis. And obviously, there is a need for drugs such as rituximab, which is the first monoclonal antibody that is approved in the US in 1998. And the only way the Rituxan could make its way in India, because the pricing difference, the pricing, the cost of $1 and the rupee, today, $1 is around 70 to 75 rupees, right? So I think and today's cost of Rituxan, if it's depending on, even though it's generic, in the US, anywhere between $5,000 or $10,000 a dose. If you translate that into amount of rupees, it's a huge amount and something that may be out of reach for the middle class and definitely for the common man. So the generics and the biosimilars that have come along, like the Dr. Reddy's lab or the Ciplas, they make these compounds, monoclonal antibodies. They're able to make these monoclonal antibodies. Now, the question is whether they have been tested head to head. I don't know that for sure, but they have been used, and there have been small studies that allowed them to be approved, and they've been used by clinicians. So in some ways, there are at least 3 or 4 companies making the same product. So for the clinicians, in some ways, they are also acting as a triage based on the economic situation of the patient. There are drugs that are priced from the original Rituxan on one end to the cheapest of the Rituxan on the other end by another company. And clinicians cannot control the pricing, but they can at least make sure that the drugs are accessible to the patients. So they have that knowledge and ability to do so. So that's how it works in India. And Rituxan is just one example. I gave you the example of Gleevec. The cost of Gleevec used to be quite a bit, I think, after the Supreme Court ruling and the entry of the second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors, the pricing has come down to about equivalent of $100 to $200 a month. And here the cost is about $15,000 a month. So it's a very different. So the way so the pricing is very different in India, right? So that's what has made it accessible. But even $100 a month is out of reach for a lot of people. So how do some of the people, the common, where the average, the median income is less than $10,000 a year, right? So how are they able to afford it is by getting a free drug. And now we are starting to see the trickle down effect from the haves and the have-nots, at least that's happening in India.